She's a friend. You are my girl. You embarrassed her. You embarrassed me. And you're supposed to be the one? Like, I don't know if I can be with someone else.
I don't know how much damage she realises she's done. It's thrown a lot of doubt in my mind. So that's a lot to think about.
Hurting. And for angry.
The point of no return does not always look loud when it arrives, because sometimes it shows up the morning after a public disaster. When the drinks are gone, the room is quiet again. And the only thing left is the ugly truth that one person crossed a line so badly that the other can no longer. Pretend this is just another rough night they will laugh off later, and that is exactly where this story starts. Not in some soft recap, not in some safe little relationship update, but in the emotional wreckage of a moment that embarrassed him in public, exposed her instability in front of other people, and forced a question neither of them can dodge anymore, which is whether this relationship is actually built to survive real life, or whether it only survives because both of them keep dragging it back from the edge every time it breaks. What makes this hit harder is that he is not reacting like a man who is simply annoyed because annoyance passes, irritation cools down. But this is deeper than that, colder than that, and much more dangerous, because once someone embarrasses you publicly, especially in a situation that turns private insecurity into a scene for everyone else to witness, the damage does not stay limited to the incident itself. It spreads into the way you start seeing that person, the way you start replaying what happened in your mind, the way you begin wondering not just why they did it, but what it says about what they are capable of doing the next time they feel threatened, jealous, ignored, or emotionally out of control. And that is why his reaction matters so much here. Because when he starts saying that he does not even know if he can be with someone after that, it does not sound like a dramatic line thrown out in anger. It sounds like a man whose trust has been cut open in public and who suddenly realizes he may not be standing in a relationship problem. He may be standing in front of a relationship truth. And the truth gets even uglier because she does apologize, which on paper should help, which should calm things down, which should give them a path back to each other. Except her apology does not come clean. It comes mixed with justification, mixed with that same old suspicion she cannot let go of, mixed with the need to still be right about Nat even while saying sorry for how she handled it. And that contradiction is exactly why the tension refuses to die. Because a real apology usually lowers the temperature, but this one keeps heat trapped inside it. This one says she regrets the embarrassment while still clinging to the belief that something underneath it was valid. And that leaves him in the worst possible emotional position. Because now he cannot even take comfort in the idea that she fully understands the damage she caused. And if she does not fully understand it, or worse, if she understands it and still thinks the underlying suspicion makes it halfway acceptable, then what exactly is he rebuilding here? That is where the relationship starts looking less like a romance under pressure and more like a cycle, because the real problem is no longer just jealousy, and it is no longer just a bar fight, and it is definitely no longer something you can reduce to one bad night, because once chaos becomes public, once humiliation gets added to insecurity, once the person who hurt you starts apologizing without fully surrendering the argument that caused the damage, the issue becomes structural. And structural problems are the ones that quietly ruin people while they are still trying to call it love. And you can feel that fear growing in him almost immediately. Because he is not just asking whether she crossed a line, he is asking whether this line will always be there. Whether every future conflict will carry the risk of becoming another scene, another accusation, another public crack-in. Whatever trust they still have left. And then Chris enters the picture. And that matters more than it looks on the surface, because outside voices in situations like this can either help patch the damage or expose it, and Chris does not function like some random side character filling space. He functions like reality stepping into the room, because when someone from the outside can see the fracture that clearly, when someone who is not blinded by chemistry, intimacy, hope, loneliness, and all the other emotional nonsense that keeps people attached to unstable relationships can look at it and basically signal that this thing might already be broken, it hits differently. Because now his private hurt has public confirmation, now his instinct is no longer alone, and that is powerful because it tells the audience, and maybe tells him too, that he is not overreacting, he is not being too proud, he is not exaggerating a bad moment, He is seeing what everyone else can already see, which is that this relationship may be hanging on by emotional habit more than real trust. That is also what makes her position so messy, because she is not easy to flatten into a villain. And that complexity is part of why this story worked, because she does not come across like someone who feels nothing. She does not look completely cold. She does not move like a person who wants to destroy the relationship. And in some ways that makes it worse, because remorse mixed with self-justification is harder to process than plain cruelty, since plain cruelty at least gives you a clean enemy. But this is murkier than that. This is somebody who seems to feel sorry and yet still wants some part of her suspicion to survive. Somebody who knows she embarrassed him but still cannot stop trying to make the emotional case that pushed her there. And people like that are hard to trust because they can make you feel guilty for the damage they caused while still asking you to see there. Pain first. So the real question forming underneath all of this is not whether she cares, because she probably does, and it is not whether he feels something real, because he clearly does. And that is what makes this dangerous rather than simple, because feelings are present on both sides, but feelings are not the same thing as safety, and a lot of unstable relationships survive much longer than they should because the feelings are strong enough to keep both people circling back after every explosion, after every apology, after every new promise that this time the damage will finally mean something. This time the lesson will finally stick. This time the chaos will not return wearing a slightly different face, and that is why his emotional conflict matters so much right now. Because he is not choosing between love and indifference, he is choosing between emotional pull and emotional self-protection, between wanting her and trusting her, between the version of the relationship he hopes is still possible and the version of it her behavior is starting to confirm. And Nat stays in the middle of all this like a pressure point that never fully disappears. Because whether Nat is a real threat or just the excuse she keeps using to defend behavior that went too far almost starts becoming secondary, since the bigger issue is that she cannot let it rest even after the damage is done. Even after he is visibly hurt, even after the situation has already proven how destructive her suspicion can become when it spills out in public, and that refusal to let go tells you something ugly about the future. Because if this is how she acts when one insecurity gets hold of her, what happens the next time another insecurity shows up? What happens when there is another female friend, another misunderstanding, another night where emotion outruns judgment, another moment where she feels threatened and decides the answer is not conversation but confrontation? That is why his line about not knowing if he can stay lands like a genuine breaking point rather than a temporary threat. Because he is not only reacting to what she did, he is reacting to the possibility that this is who she is under pressure, and if that is true, then the relationship stops being something he can simply manage with patience, reassurance, or another conversation, and becomes something he has to survive. And people can survive a lot in romance for a while, especially when they are lonely, especially when they want the connection badly enough, especially when the person hurting them is also the person making them feel chosen, understood, desired, or emotionally alive. But surviving a relationship is not the same as building one, and you can feel that distinction quietly forming here even before he says it out loud. What makes the whole situation even stickier is that he does not fully walk away, and that is the detail that should make viewers lean in harder. Because a clean breakup would actually be easier to process, easier to package, easier to understand, but that is not what happens here. Instead, the relationship feels like it almost dies and then lingers, and that lingering is what makes the next stage more dangerous. Because now the audience has to ask the question that sits underneath everything else, which is, why is he still there if the red flags are already this clear? And the answer is probably not one neat thing. It is probably a mix of chemistry, hope, loneliness, attachment, emotional momentum, and the very human tendency to believe that a painful moment means more than it should if the apology afterward feels intimate enough. But that is exactly the trap, because people often forgive chaos faster than they trust peace, and when a relationship starts running on damage and repair instead of trust and consistency, the repair can feel almost as addictive as the love itself. So this opening does not leave us with comfort, and it should not, because the most honest version of this story is that they are not standing at resolution, they are standing at exposure, with him hurt enough to question the whole relationship, with her remorseful enough to apologize but not, honest enough to fully release the suspicion, with Chris acting as the outside witness who confirms the fracture is visible, and with the future suddenly looking less like a romantic next chapter and more like a test of whether emotional intensity has been fooling both of them into calling instability something deeper than it is, and that is why the danger is not that the relationship nearly ended here. The danger is that it nearly ended and still did not. Because that means whatever comes next will not be a simple recovery, it will be a much riskier question. Whether he is staying, because she is truly worth rebuilding with, or because part of him is already trapped in a pattern where every disaster makes the attachment feel harder to leave. What makes the next phase of this story more dangerous than the blow-up itself is that the relationship does not end when logic says it probably should. Because once he stays, once he keeps talking, once he lets the emotional door remain even slightly open after being embarrassed that badly, the entire meaning of the situation changes, and suddenly this is no longer just a story about what she did wrong, it becomes a story about what he is willing to overlook, what he is willing to reinterpret, and how quickly a person can shift from saying this might be the point where they cannot. Continue to quietly searching for reasons that maybe it was not as final as it felt in the moment, and that is where this gets much more interesting and much more uncomfortable. Because people love clear villains and clean exits, but real relationships rarely give you that luxury, especially not when attraction, emotional need, and the hope of a better version are still very much alive in the room. The atmosphere changes, but it does not truly calm down. And that distinction matters, because on the surface, this part feels softer, more intimate, almost like a reset after chaos, but underneath that softer tone there is something deeply unstable about how quickly they start drifting back toward each other, as if the emotional disaster somehow created its own desire for closeness, as if the humiliation itself now needs to be healed by the same person who caused it. And that pattern is exactly what should make viewers uneasy, because when a relationship moves from public damage into private tenderness too fast, it can feel romantic on the surface while actually hiding something far more fragile underneath, which is the possibility that both people are now trying to outrun the meaning of what happened instead of truly facing it. He gives her another chance, and that is the move that complicates everything. Because the second he does that, the audience can no longer look at him as just the wronged partner standing in clear moral light. Now he becomes part of the tension too. Now his choices matter. Now he's emotional. Vulnerability becomes part of the risk, because staying after a public embarrassment does not automatically mean he is weak, irrational, or blind, but it does force a harder question, which is whether he genuinely sees something in her that is worth salvaging, or whether he is already doing what A lot of people do when they are pulled by strong chemistry, which is quietly reshaping the facts until they fit the outcome they want. And the reason that question bites so hard here is because he is not staying in spite of confusion, he is staying while fully aware of the confusion, which means he is not clueless, he is conflicted. And conflict of that kind can keep people trapped in relationships much longer than certainty ever could. That is why his emotional confession hits the way it does. Because the moment he admits he is falling in love, the whole story tilts, and not in a comforting way either. Because falling in love should sound like reassurance, it should make the audience think there is still something beautiful and worth protecting here. But instead it almost makes things more dangerous, because now viewers have to measure every choice he makes against the possibility that love is not helping him see clearly, it is helping him endure what he should be more afraid of, and that is the ugly truth. Relationships like this often hide, which is that feelings do not just deepen attachment, they can also blur judgment, soften boundaries, and make warning signs feel like temporary obstacles instead of recurring patterns. And to be fair to him, he is not behaving like a man who has completely lost his instincts, because even while opening his heart, even while letting her back into emotional range, he still questions whether she is too volatile for any real future, and that hesitation is crucial, because it keeps him human and it keeps the story honest. Since the tension here is not that he suddenly forgets the bar incident and transforms into some fool who thinks love fixes everything, it is that he tries to hold two truths at once. One being that he feels deeply for her, and one being that he does not trust what that depth will cost him if her instability is not just a bad moment, but part of the structure of who she becomes under pressure. And living between those two truths is where a lot of emotional damage begins, because that space can feel thoughtful and balanced at first, but over time it turns into self-negotiation. And self-negotiation is where boundaries quietly go to die. She becomes more layered here too, which is part of why this section works so well. Because if she came back cold, smug, or openly dismissive, the emotional road ahead would actually be easier to read. But she does not. She comes back with remorse, with softness, with enough visible regret to make the idea of repair feel possible. And that is exactly why her position becomes harder to untangle. Because she is not presenting as someone who feels nothing. She is presenting as someone who wants forgiveness while still not fully separating herself from the original suspicion that triggered. The whole thing and that contradiction is the poison still sitting inside the relationship, because remorse usually offers a path forward, but remorse that still carries an argument inside it creates a strange emotional trap where the injured person feels pulled to comfort the one who hurt them, while also realizing the deeper issue has not actually been put to rest. That is why this phase should not be read as healing. Not really. Because healing would require the original wound to be clearly named and fully respected, and what we have instead is something softer but murkier. A pause that feels affectionate enough to be mistaken for progress, even though the most explosive issue underneath it is still unresolved, and the relationship almost feels better precisely because the real issue is not being pressed too hard in the moment, which is such a dangerous kind of temporary peace, because people often mistake calm for growth when sometimes calm is just what happens when the most triggering truth is being politely avoided for a few hours. The deeper psychological tension here is the gap between emotional chemistry and emotional safety, and that gap is where the whole relationship starts to wobble in a more serious way. Because intense relationships can create a false sense of meaning. They can make every reunion feel profound, every apology feel intimate, every moment of softness feel like proof that the bond must be special if it can survive this much strain. But intensity is not always a sign of depth. Sometimes it is just what instability feels like when both people are still emotionally invested, and he may not fully know which version he is living in right now. Because from his point of view, the connection probably does feel real. The pull probably does feel hard to ignore. The tenderness after conflict probably does feel emotionally rich, but that still leaves open the much more brutal question of whether the relationship feels powerful because it is meaningful or because it keeps swinging between rupture and repair. And this is where his second chance starts looking less like a solution and more like a test. Because by staying, he is not proving the relationship is strong, he is revealing what he hopes the relationship could still become. And hope is one of the most dangerous emotional substances people carry into unstable situations. Because hope can sound wise, patient, romantic, forgiving, mature, but it can also quietly become the excuse that keeps a person standing in the same place while waiting for evidence that never fully arrives. And the problem for him is that her apology becomes more effective precisely because he wants it to be enough, not because he is blind, not because he is easy to manipulate, but because when you already care for someone, when you can feel yourself falling deeper, when the idea of losing them carries real emotional weight, you do not need a perfect apology to stay. You just need an apology that gives your hope something to attach itself to. That makes every softer moment between them feel emotionally loaded in a way that is not completely safe. Because the private recovery gives them space to reconnect, but it also gives him space to rationalize, and those are not always the same thing. Because closeness can blur seriousness, attraction can reduce urgency, and tenderness can make people treat unresolved danger like something that can be dealt with later. Which is how some relationships slide from one warning sign into the next without ever fully stopping to face what the pattern is becoming. And that is the key word. Here, pattern. Because this section should keep asking whether he is witnessing a one-time emotional failure or the early shape of something repeatable, something that will reappear every time insecurity spikes and every time reassurance stops working quickly enough. She seems to understand enough to try to repair things, but even that repair has a question mark hanging over it. Because when somebody makes a warm, generous move after causing damage, it can come from sincerity, from guilt, from fear, from strategy, or from some messy blend of all four. And the complication here is that her effort does not feel entirely fake, which makes it more effective and more suspicious at the same time. Because genuine care and emotional self-interest are not opposites, people can feel sorry and still want to protect their position. They can want closeness and still want validation. They can regret the scene and still not surrender the belief that pushed them into it. And that is why viewers should be left unsettled rather than reassured by the softer phase of their connection. The bigger problem, the one sitting quietly beneath every gentle moment here, is that the relationship seems easiest when the deeper trust issue is not being pushed into the center. And that should worry him more than it comforts him. Because a relationship that only feels stable while the core wound is being tiptoed around is not stable at all. It is just temporarily unprovoked, and there's a huge difference between those two states, even if they can look identical for a little while. Especially to people who badly want the connection to survive. So when he opens up emotionally, when he admits he is falling in love, when he lets the audience see that this is not just about attraction or habit, but about real feeling, it does not solve the story, it actually makes the risk more painful. Because now the audience understands that what keeps him there is not denial, it is investment. And investment is exactly what makes emotionally unstable relationships so hard to leave, since the more real the feeling becomes, the easier it is to treat each warning sign like a challenge to work through rather than a truth to accept. And that is why the final move here matters so much, because when she sets up the private rental, it lands with that same double meaning running through everything else. On one level, it looks like repair, like intimacy, like a conscious effort to create a better space between them. But on another level, it raises a much sharper question, which is whether this is actually about building safety or about moving the relationship forward fast enough that the unresolved trust wound loses its power to stop her. And that is the dangerous beauty of this phase, because nothing is simple anymore. Not him, not her, not the apology, not the closeness, not the hope, and definitely not the relationship itself, since what looked like it might end in the aftermath of humiliation has now turned into something more emotionally gripping and more psychologically slippery. A relationship that feels alive again on the surface while carrying the same unanswered fear underneath. And the real reason this keeps the audience locked in is because a breakup would have been easier to understand, while this second chance opens a darker, more compelling mystery. Whether he is seeing the beginning of real change or just the softer face of the same cycle getting ready to pull him in even deeper. The most dangerous stage of a shaky relationship is usually not the explosion, it is the softer moment right after. The one that looks calm enough to fool people into thinking progress is happening when what is really happening is something much riskier. Because now both people are standing inside a temporary peace that has not actually earned its own stability yet. And that is exactly why this part of the story matters so much. Because the private rental changes the mood just enough to make everything feel almost normal, almost romantic, almost like they have found their way back to each other. And for a little while, that illusion is strong enough to work, which is what makes the next turn hit much harder than it would have if they were still openly fighting. Because viewers get to see the version of them that almost makes sense before the deeper pressure point gets pushed, and the whole relationship quietly shifts from a messy romance into something far more serious and far more morally loaded. The private setting helps them in the most obvious way first, which is that it removes witnesses, removes noise, removes the public tension that made the earlier blow-up feel so humiliating, and in that quieter environment, they can finally perform the version of closeness both of them seem desperate to recover, the version where the chemistry is visible, the comfort appears possible, and the relationship briefly stops looking like a disaster and starts looking like something that might actually be worth saving, but that is exactly why the calm should feel suspicious rather than reassuring. Because a relationship can seem stable when nothing is pressing on its weakest point, and that does not mean the weakness is gone. It only means the conditions have shifted enough for both people to breathe around it for a moment, and human beings are extremely good at mistaking relief for resolution when they badly want the connection to survive. That is why the softer atmosphere here should not be read as proof that the earlier damage was exaggerated. because if anything, it raises the tension in a more subtle way, since now the audience has to sit inside that uneasy question of whether this is the real relationship reappearing or just the most flattering version of it, the version that comes out when jealousy is quiet, when insecurity is not activated, when public embarrassment is no longer fresh enough to dominate every exchange. And that is what makes this stage so effective. Because for a little while, viewers can honestly see why he has not walked away. They can see why he keeps holding the door open, why he is tempted to believe the connection is deeper than the chaos, why the hope is still alive, because in the right setting, with the pressure dialed down, they can look almost good together. And that almost is the whole trap. Then she makes the move that changes the scale of the entire story, because once she starts pushing to meet his son, this stops being about whether they can recover from a bad moment between two adults and become something much heavier, much more revealing, and much less romantic in the easy sense. Because his son is not just another detail from his life, not just another box to check on the road to getting closer, not just some symbolic milestone the way social media brain people talk about taking the next step. His son is the most protected part of him, the part of his life that cannot be casually exposed to chaos, the part that forces him to stop thinking like a man who is only evaluating whether a woman fits his feelings and start thinking like a father who has to evaluate whether a woman fits his reality. And that change in frame is enormous, because suddenly the real question is not simply can they stay together, it is should he let her any closer at all. That is the point where the audience should split, because her request can be read in two completely different ways, and both of them are believable enough to create real tension, which is exactly the kind of division that keeps people emotionally locked in, since one side will look at her and say this is what accountability looks like when someone is trying to show they are serious, that she is not just asking for another romantic night or some vague emotional reassurance, she is asking to enter the real world of his life, to prove that what she wants is not temporary passion, but something more grounded and committed. And if you already want to believe in her, if you already see her remorse as genuine, if you are the kind of viewer who leans toward redemption arcs, then this request can absolutely land as a sincere effort to move beyond surface level repair and show him that she is trying to become part of something real. But the other reading is just as powerful and maybe even stronger, because there is something deeply premature about asking for access to the most sensitive part of a man's life right after you have shown him how emotionally unsafe you can become under pressure. And that is where the discomfort lives. Because if she has not fully earned back trust with him yet, why is she already reaching for the most emotionally protected territory he has? Why is the conversation moving toward his son before the relationship itself has demonstrated enough stability to deserve that kind of expansion? And if you are a viewer on that side, then her request does not feel sincere. It feels strategic. It feels like an attempt to secure legitimacy before she has actually built the foundation that legitimacy is supposed to rest on. Almost like she understands that the fastest way to make herself feel real in his life is to gain access to the person he protects most. That is why his reaction becomes the center of the act. Because this request does not land on neutral ground, it lands directly on the place where he is softest, and the second he starts talking emotionally about being away from his son, the whole scene changes temperature again. Because now, the audience is not just watching a relationship negotiation, they are watching a man expose the deepest part of his emotional architecture. The place where longing, guilt, distance, tenderness, and protectiveness all live together, and when a person opens that door, even verbally, it means a lot. It means the conversation has moved beyond chemistry and beyond surface intimacy and into the area of real-life stakes, and that is why this moment should not be played as a cute next step. Because it is not cute, it is costly, it is serious, and it is loaded with the possibility that went wrong. Choice here does not just affect him, it affects the most important emotional responsibility he carries. What makes it even more layered is that he does not seem emotionally untouched by the request, and that matters because if he dismissed it instantly, there would be less tension, less division, less reason to keep leaning forward, but he does not. And that is where things get dangerous, because now viewers have to ask whether he is moved by the request for the right reason or the wrong one, whether he sees it as proof of real commitment or whether part of him is simply vulnerable to being needed, wanted, and emotionally claimed in a way that makes the relationship feel deeper than it may actually be. And that is not a small distinction, because some people mistake requests for access as proof of sincerity when sometimes they are just proof that the other person wants to lock in a position before trust has been properly built. This is also where the real threat in the relationship starts to reveal itself more clearly, because the deeper problem may never have been Nat in the first place. Not really, not in the long-term sense, because Nat may have been the trigger, the obsession point, the name around which jealousy and insecurity organized themselves, but the more serious issue is that he and Elise seem to define trust in completely different ways. And that is the sort of mismatch that can quietly destroy a future even when attraction is strong. Because he seems to want trust to mean emotional steadiness, restraint, consistency, and the ability to protect peace when feelings get messy, while she seems to treat trust as something that must constantly be proven to her, constantly reassured, constantly clarified. And when those two definitions collide, every future conflict becomes bigger than the specific issue that started it. Because one person is asking for calm and the other is asking for proof. That is why the private rental working at first is not comfort, it is setup. Because the calmer they seem in that space, the more jarring it becomes when the conversation turns toward his son, and the audience realizes that the next step on the table is not romantic at all, it is parental and moral. And that shift matters because adults can choose to forgive risk around themselves in ways they should never be willing to extend toward a child, especially a child who is not responsible for any of this emotional confusion and should not be made part of it until the adults involved have proven they know how to manage themselves with far more consistency than these two have shown so far. And this is the cruel beauty of the moment, because there is no single clean answer the audience can settle into, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes it so strong, since she may genuinely believe that asking to meet his son is how she proves she is serious, and he may genuinely feel that. Her wanting that kind of closeness says something meaningful about her investment. But sincerity is not the same as readiness, and intention is not the same as fitness. And wanting to belong inside someone's real life is not the same as being emotionally safe enough to enter it. And the reason people get trapped in these moments is because emotional meaning and emotional wisdom do not always arrive together. So by the end of this phase, the relationship has become much more gripping precisely because it has stopped being just a relationship. Because now it is also a question of boundaries, judgment, fatherhood, timing, and whether two people who can barely hold emotional peace around jealousy should really be talking about access to the most sensitive corner of his world, and the most unsettling part is that he does not shut it down completely, which is where the true tension lives. Because if his instincts were fully in charge, the answer might be simple, but his instincts are sharing space with hope, loneliness, desire, and the seductive feeling that maybe this request means she wants something real. And that leaves the audience in the most uncomfortable place possible, wondering whether he is about to make a hopeful move forward or whether he is standing at the edge of a shortcut that feels meaningful now but could turn out to be the exact decision his own caution was trying to protect him from. This is the point where the relationship stops being confusing in an entertaining way and starts becoming heavy in a way that actually demands judgment. Because once his son enters the conversation, the emotional math changes completely, and suddenly he is no longer allowed the luxury of evaluating her through chemistry, longing, attraction, or even the softer hope that maybe this rough patch was just a bad chapter in something that could still become beautiful. Because now he has to ask a much harder question, and it is the kind of question that ruins fantasy fast, which is not whether she makes him feel something real, but whether she is emotionally safe enough to move any closer to the part of his life that matters most. And that shift is brutal, because people can rationalize a lot when the fallout only hits their own heart, but the second that fallout could touch their child, the excuses start sounding thinner, the emotions start feeling less romantic, and the truth starts demanding a clearer answer. What makes this part so strong is that the power balance visibly changes, but not in a clean way. Because on paper, he now has control, he is the gatekeeper, he is the one who decides whether deeper access happens or not, and that should give him emotional clarity. It should make him steadier, firmer, more protected against the pull of the relationship. But real life does not work that neatly, and neither do unstable attachments. Because even while he holds the practical power, he is still emotionally compromised by the fact that he wants this to be real, he wants the connection to mean something, he wants the softer version of her to be the truth instead of the exception. And that is what makes his position so difficult. Because people are most vulnerable not when they have no control, but when they do have control and still do not know whether they will use it wisely. That is why the pressure in this phase should keep building even when nobody is screaming. Because the loudest danger now is not the possibility of another public scene right this second, it is the quieter realization that he is standing at the place where romance has to answer to reality. And reality is much less impressed by feelings than people are. Because reality asks different questions. It asks whether the person in front of you can regulate themselves when insecurity gets activated, whether they can protect peace instead of simply apologizing after destroying it, whether they know how to be trusted rather than just how to beg for trust after things go wrong. And those are not small questions, those are future questions, structure questions, family questions, and he cannot avoid them anymore just because the chemistry still has a pulse. That is also where the emotional truth of this relationship starts becoming harder to escape, because being loved and being safe are not the same thing, and a lot of people spend years confusing those two until they finally realize one can exist without the other, that a person can care for you deeply and still be dangerous to your peace, that someone can want a future with you and still not be emotionally stable enough to build one. And this story has been circling that truth for a while, but now it has to start saying it more clearly. Because if she cannot manage herself when jealousy gets triggered, then the real issue is no longer one bar fight, one apology, or one argument about Nat. The issue becomes pattern risk. And pattern risk is what adults should fear more than isolated mistakes. Because isolated mistakes can be learned from, but patterns do not disappear because the last apology felt sincere. That is why his father instinct rising to the surface matters so much here. Because it cuts through some of the emotional fog that has protected this relationship up to now. And that instinct does not care how romantic the private moments felt. It does not care how emotionally intense the reconnection seemed. It does not care how badly he wants to believe she is trying. Because fatherhood introduces a harder standard, one that asks not whether she means well, but whether her behavior has earned trust at the level she is now requesting. And that is a painful standard to apply when you care about someone. Because the more genuine his feelings are, the more brutal it becomes to admit that they may not be enough to justify the next step she wants. And the reason this gets heavier instead of clearer is because he does appear emotionally open to the idea of integrating her further, which means the audience cannot relax into a simple answer. Because if he were cold, detached, or fully closed off, then the tension would collapse into something easier, but he is not. He is still reachable, still emotionally engaged, still tempted by the possibility that this relationship could become something bigger than its worst moment. And that is exactly what makes his openness dangerous rather than comforting, because it means the decision is not being made from pure caution, it is being made from inside the conflict, from inside the longing, from inside the very emotional investment that could distort his judgment if he lets it. Then the undercut comes in, and it has to come in. Because every time the relationship starts looking slightly more hopeful, the unresolved foundation problem has to show its face again. And here that problem is impossible to ignore since she still has not fully dropped the old suspicion. Which means the audience is being forced to hold the same disturbing thought he should be holding too. That the real test was never whether she could apologize sweetly or reconnect romantically, it was whether she could release the very mindset that made the explosion possible in the first place. And if she has not fully done that, then what exactly is he rewarding with deeper access? What exactly is he trusting? And what exactly is he risking on the promise that things will somehow be calmer later, when the raw material of future conflict is still sitting right there, unresolved and ready to flare again? That is where partial clarity starts arriving, and it should feel less comforting than the audience expects, because the closer you look, the more obvious it becomes that Nat was never really the full story. Not even close. She was the surface issue, the trigger point, the name attached to the insecurity, but the deeper problem is structural, because this relationship seems to operate on opposite emotional instincts, with one person asking for proof, reassurance, and constant confirmation, while the other is desperate for peace, steadiness, and the ability to exist without every female. Connection becoming a threat to be interrogated, and that mismatch is not solved by romance, it is not solved by attraction, and it definitely is not solved by escalating commitment faster than trust has actually matured. That is why access to his son cannot be treated like some cute symbol of progress, because it is consequential in a way everything before this was not. And the act has to keep making that feel real, because when adults move too fast around a child, they are not just taking emotional risks for themselves, they are creating confusion, attachment, and potential fallout for somebody who had no role in creating the instability in the first place, and that reality should weigh on him heavily. Because if he knows the relationship is still unstable, if he knows her emotional regulation is still in question, if he knows the deeper issue has not actually been solved, then bringing his son anywhere near that uncertainty would not be hopeful. It would be reckless. And the more clearly that truth forms, the harder it becomes for him to hide inside softer language about second chances and emotional growth. Still, that does not make the decision easy, and that is what keeps this phase emotionally sharp. Because accepting the truth about pattern risk can feel, from the inside, like abandoning someone you care about, and that is the psychological knife twisting through this whole section. Because the person who finally sets a boundary in a situation like this often feels guilt long before they feel relief, especially if the other person is not monstrous, not cold, not easy to hate, but merely unstable, emotional, remorseful in flashes, and still very capable of making the relationship feel meaningful in its better moments. And that is why people negotiate with their own discomfort for far too long. Because a hard boundary can feel cruel when you are still emotionally attached, even if the boundary is exactly what wisdom requires. So he is left weighing what he feels against what he knows, and that weighing process is what gives this part its real force. Because what he feels is not fake, it is not trivial, it is not just lust or habit or fear of being alone. It may genuinely include affection, hope, tenderness, and the desire to see the best in her, but what he knows is becoming harder to dismiss, because what he knows is that the relationship has already shown a willingness to turn insecurity into damage. What he knows is that apology and repair have so far been stronger than regulation and prevention. What he knows is that calm has mostly existed when the pressure point was not being pressed, and what he knows is that once a child becomes part of the equation, that level of uncertainty stops being romantic struggle and starts becoming an unacceptable gamble. That is where the act should keep tightening, because every answer leads to a bigger question, and every softer moment now has a darker shadow behind it, since the main issue is no longer whether she is trying, but whether trying is enough, whether caring is enough, whether wanting access is enough, whether being loved by her is enough. And the emerging answer is unsettling precisely because it is so emotionally unfair, which is that love may be real here and still not be enough to make the relationship safe, and safety is the thing that starts mattering most once you leave the fantasy zone of adult chemistry and enter the reality zone of a life that includes a child, real boundaries, and consequences that do not disappear once the mood improves. By the end of this stage, the audience should feel the terrible shape of the truth, even if nobody says it in one clean sentence yet. Because the relationship is still alive, still emotionally breathing, still capable of producing intimacy and hope, but the frightening part is that being alive is no longer the same thing as being healthy, and surviving is no longer the same thing as deserving expansion, and that leaves him standing in the most difficult position of all. Emotionally open but morally cornered, wanting the relationship to be real while slowly being forced to confront the possibility that what is real about it may not be its future, but its instability. And if that is true, then the final judgment waiting ahead is unavoidable, because sooner or later he will have to decide whether love can outrun that instability, or whether the instability has already told him everything he needs to know. By the time this story reaches its emotional endpoint, the hardest truth is no longer hidden, it is just painful. Because what he is really facing now is not a simple choice between staying and leaving. And it is not some dramatic fork in the road where one path is obviously love and the other path is obviously wisdom. It is much uglier than that and much more familiar to anyone who has ever tried to make sense of a relationship that felt real but also felt unsafe. Because what he has to confront now is whether he is choosing an actual woman with whom a future can be built, or whether he is choosing a cycle that keeps dressing itself up as passion every time it survives another blow-up. And that is the reason this ending works best, when it does not pretend everything has become clean. Because clean endings are comforting, and this story is not really built for comfort, it is built for recognition. The feelings are genuine. And that matters, because flattening this into some cheap conclusion where his heart means nothing and her remorse means nothing would actually weaken the entire story, since the reason this relationship held on as long as it did is precisely because the emotional connection was not fake, the pull was not imaginary, the tenderness was not manufactured, and his desire to believe in her was not just stupidity, it was human. And that distinction matters because people do not stay stuck in unstable relationships only because they are blind. They stay because some part of the relationship is real enough to keep arguing with the part of them that knows better, and he has clearly been living inside that argument for a while now, wanting to trust what he feels while slowly realizing that feeling deeply for someone is not the same thing as being ready to build a life with them. That is the shift this whole story has been moving toward. The point where romance stops being judged by how intense it feels and starts being judged by whether it can actually hold peace. And that shift is brutal because intensity is easier to notice than stability. Intensity flatters people. It makes them feel chosen, desired, emotionally alive. It can even make dysfunction feel meaningful. But stability is quieter and less glamorous and much harder to fake over time. And once he starts thinking in those terms, once he stops asking only whether he loves her and starts asking whether peace with her can actually last, the relationship changes in his mind whether he wants it to or not. That is why the final escalation here is internal rather than theatrical. Because he does not need another bar scene to know what is at stake anymore. He does not need another explosion, another outside witness, another half apology wrapped around the same old insecurity. Because he already has enough evidence, and the real conflict now is whether he can accept what that evidence means without feeling like he is betraying someone he still cares about. And that is one of the hardest emotional positions to stand in. Because when the person in front of you is not all bad, not cruel in some, easy to dismiss way, not impossible to care about, setting a boundary can feel harsher than staying, even when staying is the thing that quietly keeps breaking your trust. And trust is the key word now. Not love, not attraction, not hope. Because the final answer to the central question is not that he feels nothing. And it is not even that he has closed the door completely. It is that he is not fully ready to trust her emotionally. And he has valid reasons for that, because trust is not built by surviving one emotional weekend. It is not built by one apology that lands well enough to soften the mood. And it is definitely not built by somebody wanting deeper access before they have proven they can handle shallower responsibility with consistency. And that is where the story finds its strongest clarity, because a future with her is still emotionally possible. Maybe, but only if she proves stability over time. Not because one romantic reset felt promising, and not because one moment of vulnerability made the connection feel deeper than the warning signs. That truth also settles the question of whether she really repaired the damage, because the honest answer is only partially. And partial repair is one of the most dangerous things in relationships like this, because it can feel like enough when you are emotional, enough when you are lonely, enough when the chemistry is still working, enough when the person who hurt you knows how to make closeness feel intense again. But partial repair is not resolution, especially when the belief underneath the damage never fully leaves, and that is the part she never truly surrendered. Because even When she softened, even when she apologized, even when she seemed to understand the embarrassment she caused, there was still that lingering need to keep some version of her suspicion alive, to hold on to the idea that beneath the mess she was not entirely wrong, and that matters because when the belief that fueled the outburst is still alive, the pattern that produced the outburst is still alive too. Which means Nat was never really the final threat, and the story becomes much more useful once that clicks into place, because Nat was the trigger, the visible focus, the person around whom the tension organized itself, but the actual threat was instability and unresolved mistrust, the kind that turns discomfort into accusation and private fear into public damage, and once he sees that clearly, he has to stop asking whether Nat can be explained away and start asking whether the structure of the relationship itself can ever become safe enough to hold a real future. Because if the next insecurity just finds a new target, then nothing meaningful was solved at all. That is also why his son becomes the turning point rather than just another detail in the story, because the son forces him to stop grading the relationship on present emotion and start grading it on future consequence, and that is a brutal but necessary transition since adults can romanticize a lot when they are only gambling with their own hearts, but once a child enters the edge of that decision, the standards have to rise whether the feelings like it or not, and that is where the final judgment gets sharper. Because now the next mistake would not just be another difficult scene. Between two adults trying to work through their issues, it would hit inside a more protected space, a more serious space, and the cost of getting it wrong becomes much heavier. And still, the story should not pretend the possibility is completely dead, because that would be too neat and also less honest than what this relationship actually is. Because he may remain emotionally open, he may still hope that she can become steadier, he may still want the version of them that feels warm, intimate, and connected in the quieter moments, and the dangerous beauty of that hope should be acknowledged before the final clarity lands. Because this is not a story where one revelation suddenly drains all feeling out of him. He may very well still let himself imagine what deeper connection could look like. And that moment matters because it makes the final truth hit harder when it arrives, which is that the relationship's biggest problem is not whether love exists, it is whether peace can survive inside it. That is the line the whole story has really been walking toward, because love is not the missing ingredient here, safety is, and those are not interchangeable no matter how often unstable couples try to treat them that way. Because he does not just need someone who feels strongly for him, he needs someone who can create predictability, someone who can protect trust instead of continually testing it, someone who can sit in discomfort without turning it into spectacle, and someone who can be near the most important parts of his life without making him wonder what happens the next time. Insecurity gets provoked, and until that exists, until that becomes visible not in words but in repeated behavior over time, he does not really have what he would need for a shared future, he just has feelings trying to outrun a pattern. And that is the final internal reckoning, the one that matters more than any outer drama, because he has to separate love from trust, and that is one of the most painful separations a person can make, since it means admitting that your heart may still move towards someone your nervous system knows. Longer experiences as safe, and that is not weakness, it is not cruelty, it is not some dramatic overreaction, it is maturity arriving late and ruining the fantasy just enough to save the future. Because once a person recognizes that they feel deeply and still do not feel settled, that they want closeness and still do not feel at peace, that they can imagine the relationship continuing and still cannot imagine it being safe around their child unless something fundamentally changes, then the honest answer stops being whether they care and becomes whether care alone is enough, and here it is not. So the relationship survives in emotional possibility, but not in genuine security, and that is the cleanest way to understand where this leaves them. Because it is not a fairy tale ending, and it is not a total collapse either, it is something more uncomfortable and more real. A relationship that may continue existing in hope, attraction, and emotional openness, but cannot honestly be trusted with deeper integration unless stability shows up in a repeated, convincing, and very unglamorous way over time. And that is why the last insight has to land hard, because this was never really About one jealous scene at a bar, that was just the moment the hidden structure finally became visible. What this story is actually about is the point where romance stops being measured by sparks and starts being measured by whether those sparks keep setting the same things on fire, and that is the part viewers can argue about after the video ends. Because some people will still look at them and see hope, chemistry, the possibility of growth, the evidence that she cares and that he feels something worth protecting, while others will look at the same story and see a man standing one step away from repeating a mistake he already understands, and both reactions make sense, which is exactly why the ending lingers, because he may be falling in love, but the deeper truth is uglier and more useful than love songs ever admit, and it is this: love can keep a shaky relationship alive much longer than it should, but it cannot make instability safe.